Okie dokie. So we're going to start with the reading. Brother Jonah. Jonah's going to read for us Ruth chapter 1.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Jonah. Thank you for that reading, and thank you for the invitation to be here tonight. It's my absolute pleasure that I come and share my thoughts with you on Ruth, and it's an absolute pleasure to open the Word of God and to have it speak. Now, this came out of a talk that I gave a few years ago, and I was asked to give a talk on Ruth, and I wasn't that excited about giving the talk because I thought I knew everything about Ruth. I thought it's a pretty straightforward story. How much can there be to it? And as we read Ruth chapter 1, and some of us might be quite familiar with that story, it seems fairly inconsequential. But as I've delved into this particularly chapter 1, I've come to realize that Ruth is a remarkable person, and that this is one of the great stories of the Bible. And in fact, the period of the Judges spanned for about 400 years, and there's only one person in that period of 400 years that got their own book, and that was Ruth. And in fact, her and Esther are the only two women that books are named after. So of all those judges, of all those amazing things that happened at that time, she's the one that gets a book. And I've called this, this is the first part. I'm presenting again in 2 weeks, and this is covenants and commitments. So a big question that comes out of the story of Ruth is, who are you? And this is a really good question to ask yourself. Who am I? Something that comes out of that is, what does commitment look like? You can talk about commitment. It can sound like it has a nice ring to it as a word, but what does commitment look like when you put it under the magnifying glass? I'm in the building industry. I work as an architect, and often I'm called out to look at properties to assess them for whether they're worth renovating, for instance, a house. And we pretty much can repurpose any kind of building, and as buildings become more expensive, there's more reasons to renovate buildings. But if the foundation of a building is not good, and when I say foundation, I mean the ground under the building, and perhaps even the concrete that sits on that ground. If the foundation is not good, if the building is dismantled and right down underneath it is not good, then it's not worth keeping. Usually we just say demolish. And so tonight we're going to consider Ruth, and we're going to ask the question of ourselves, what does our life rest on? What have we built our house on? So let's have a look. Just a quick recap. We've got a famine in the land. We've got a family that lives in Bethlehem, and that consists of Elimelech and the husband, and Naomi, the wife, and they've got 2 boys, Mahlon and Chilion. And there's a famine in the land, so they decide to leave. They decide to do the reversal of the Exodus journey, in a sense, and they go from Bethlehem, they go down the road down to Jericho, and they cross the Jordan, and they're heading in the wrong direction, and they're heading to the land of Moab. Now it says that they were going to sojourn in verse 1. They were going to sojourn in the land, and that means reside temporarily. So I don't think Elimelech's plan was to stay there permanently. One of the questions that comes up is, was it wrong for Elimelech to leave Israel and go to Moab? Was this a wrong thing for him to do? Some people have compared him leaving Bethlehem a bit like the prodigal son leaving, or a bit like Abraham when there was a famine and he went down to Egypt and got into trouble down there. And added to the fact that not only does he die, but both his sons die. Seems like it's a bit of a cursed trip. Mahlon's name means sickly, and Chilion's name is wasting. That's what it means. So maybe they were born and they weren't that healthy. Maybe they got those names because of who they were. But even though, whichever way we look at it, he's heading in the wrong directions. He's heading out of the promised land. And if we look at the words of Naomi in Ruth chapter 1, it seems that she has some remorse about the trip that they've made. And it seems that she is pointing to the fact that she's being punished and that this has been something of God. Why did Elimelech travel to Moab when others didn't? So why did others stay weathering the famine in Bethlehem? Because Naomi eventually returns to Bethlehem and there's people there. Well, there's a theory that floats around that as an Ephrathite, Elimelech may have been quite wealthy. The name indicates that he may have been from an ancient noble line. And so there's a theory that goes around that it could have been that it was his actual wealth may have been one of the things for him to leave, because he was in fear of losing what he had, as his neighbours and his relatives called on his wealth to support them through the famine. Having said that, people move all the time in life, and they start a new life for themselves somewhere else, or they may do that to avoid disgrace. But at the end of the day, whatever reason, Elimelech dies. And so the sons marry, and they marry Moabites. So we're brought to the next question: was it wrong for the sons to marry women of Moab? Now, some say that God did not expressly forbid Israelites to marry Moabites. There's other cases where he did insist, and that was in the case of Canaanites. They were forbidden to marry Canaanites, but not Moabites. Nevertheless, the marriage took place. And, the people who view Elimelech's move as being a negative one probably, point to Mahlon and Chilion's marriages as not being great, because in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 3 and 4, we're told that intermarriage was not encouraged because God did not want the Israelites marrying people who worshipped false gods. And so in Deuteronomy 7, we read, "Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods. And the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you." So there's the implication that marrying outside of Israel was not a good idea, and it's because often people would get taken away from worshipping the true God and get dragged into the worship of other gods. And a final question is, who were these girls? Orpah and Ruth. And some rabbis believe that Ruth was actually Orpah's sister. And that in fact that they may have been daughters of the king of Eglon of Moab. He obviously would have had lots of children. This isn't verified in the Bible, certainly, but if it was that they were related to the royal family, it takes them from being simple Moabite women's, and it adds another dimension to the story, as we see, if they were in fact, but we don't know. But what are the facts? The facts are that they marry the boys, and then the boys die as well. And so we're left in Ruth chapter 1 with a lot of death. And we have 3 women on the road. It's a bleak picture, isn't it? 3 widows walking on the road. What is the situation for these people? Well, we know that that when Naomi heard that the famine had broke in the land, she was in the fields. So I would say Naomi was probably in Moab in the fields, gleaning, like they end up having to do in Israel. So the situation is not good. They're widows. They've suffered loss, certainly of their husbands. They've been surrounded by death. They're poor. They're vulnerable. Naomi can't stay in Moab. She has to return with her tail between her legs back to Bethlehem because she's got no future in Moab. And in their society, and certainly at that time, a woman's voice was through her father or through her husband. And in this case, all three of them had neither. So they're in a precarious position. They're certainly not in a position of strength, and they're heading into the unknown. They're basically at rock bottom. You're looking at a desperate situation, a dangerous situation. And then in verse 11, what do we have? Naomi says, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I sons in my womb that they may become your husband?" And so Naomi explains, you know what, girls, it's almost as though Naomi has an epiphany on the road. She packs up the little that she has. She gets on the road to head back to Bethlehem. And as she's traveling along with the two girls, it dawns on her. She comes out of a mist and she says, you know what? You girls are better off going back to Moab. At this point, they probably hadn't crossed the Jordan. They're probably on the road. And that comes out in the conversation that the girls have with Naomi. But Naomi has this epiphany. She says, you know what, girls, I'm a widow. I've got no prospects back in Bethlehem. Your prospects are much better back in the land of Moab, back with your people, back with your family, back with your gods. Don't come with me and become widows in a foreign land. And so Orpah is practical. Orpah says, you know what, Naomi, you're probably right. If I come with you, I'm probably actually going to be a burden on you. I'm going to be more of a worry for you. So Orpah, despite the tears, she says, I'm going home. So she turns around and leaves. But when it gets to Ruth, she says, after she says, return to your people, in verse 12, she says, turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And in verse 15, Naomi says, your sister-in-law is being practical. She's returned to her people. Go after her and follow her. And so we're left with two. We're left with Naomi and Ruth. So Orpah's gone. Now, this is an amazing scene because we have two people standing in the same situation, in the same circumstances, but they're seeing two completely different things. And they have two completely different outlooks. So let's have a look at Naomi first. She's suffered loss, probably maybe more loss than Ruth, because she's not only lost her husband, but she's lost her sons. And she's heading back home, and she's about to experience shame because she's experiencing the shame of having left in the famine and having to return to her hometown in Bethlehem, where everyone's going to be waiting for her. And everyone's going to say, Naomi's back. And that's how it works out. When she arrives at the town, they're all there. In verse 19, so the two of them went and came to Bethlehem. And when they came, the whole town was stirred. Naomi's back. Because of them. They probably heard about Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion. Is this Naomi? And she said to them, do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. This is a God thing. Why call me Naomi? Well, actually, the name Naomi means pleasant and gentle. She says, don't call me pleasant and gentle. Don't call me by that name. I'm bitter. The Lord has testified against me. God has spoken against me in the unfolding events of my life. And the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. She's depressed. She's dark. This is how she arrives home. That's Naomi. That's how she was feeling on the road. By the time they cross the Jordan and they make their way up the hill and they get to Bethlehem, these are the words that are coming out of her mouth. But let's have a look at Ruth. Ruth also suffered loss. But Ruth has options. Like Orpah, she's got the option to go back home. In some ways, Ruth has more to risk because Naomi, despite being ashamed, she's going back to the familiar. She's going back to a place where they speak her language, where she understands the customs, where she understands what's on the shelves in the shops, where she knows the stories, she knows the people. Ruth is heading to a place where she doesn't speak the language. She doesn't know how their society operates. She doesn't know how to buy stuff at the shop. She doesn't know anybody. She doesn't have old friends that she went to school with. She's got nothing. She's leaving home. She's leaving the known. She's leaving the familiar. She's definitely heading into the unknown. She's heading away from security despite being a foreign widow. And she's got worse prospects of marriage. And if she was part of the royal family, which is a speculation, but say she was, she may even be heading from a life of privilege if she indeed was in that family. And so I call this the road of decision. It's the road to Bethlehem, but it's the road of decision. Orpah's made her decision. And we're about to see a decision that Ruth's going to make. And we've got two people, Naomi and Ruth, standing in the same situation, looking at the same thing with completely different outlooks. And how do we know? Well, in a place where Naomi is bitter, where everyone, anyone's appearance, this is a tragic, hopeless situation. Ruth says something remarkable. In fact, I would say Ruth sees something remarkable. She has incredible insight in this moment of insecurity. And what is it? Well, it's here in red. It's a declaration. Ruth makes a declaration on the road of uncertainty, on the road of decision. Ruth puts a stake in the ground before crossing the Jordan. And what does she say? And she's saying this to Naomi. She says, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. In other words, I'm coming with you, Naomi, whether you like it or not. That's what I'm doing. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. In other words, Naomi, I am not going to abandon you. Your home is my home. Wherever you sleep tonight, or next week, or the week after, that's where I'm going to be. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. What does Ruth say? She says, I am joining the house of Israel, and I will serve the God of Israel. And despite being a Moabite widow with no means and no prospects, this is my choice This is who I am. And in a place where Naomi sees death and judgment and the harsh hand of God, and she is feeling bitterness, Ruth sees identity, a home. Ruth sees security and shelter under the God of Israel. And it reminds me of Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 14. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. And Paul writes this in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and he's talking about people who are persecuted and people who are in very difficult situations and people who are dying. And he says, you know what? Don't focus on the present circumstances. Don't focus on what you can see around you, even if it's death. Set your eyes on the unseen. Think about what he's saying. He's saying what you should be looking at is what you can't see. That doesn't really make sense, does it? He says what you can see is temporary. Everything around you, even this beautiful house of Lindsay and Liana's, is passing. I'm in the building industry. I demolish houses like these after 100 years. It won't be here. As good as the roof went on with that lake and the salt and the decay, it's all passing. The people around you, as strong as Jamin is, he's got a use-by date. He's passing. Almost up. And so we have Ruth, and she's not seeing the situation she's in. Naomi is, and Ruth is seeing something extraordinary. I also think of, and I may have shared this with you before, it's one of my favourite stories out of 2 Kings 6, where we have Elisha, and he's with his servant, and they're in the city of Dothan, and King of Aram's really mad with Elisha because Elisha can hear the words that are said in his private chambers. And so he sends the army down to Dothan. And the army of the king of Aram is surrounding the city. And when Elisha's servant gets up early in the morning, he sees a situation which is hopeless. He says, Elisha, my master, we're surrounded. We haven't got a hope. This is a hopeless situation, and Elisha prays that God open his eyes and he sees. And what does he see? He sees the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And suddenly the perspective is changed. The odds are flipped. It's the same situation, but the servant has been changed because of his understanding. The situation's the same. Why? Because there's still an army there, and they're still bent on destruction of the city and destruction of Elisha. But now there is understanding, and this is when Elisha says to his servant, don't be afraid. The prophet answered, those who are with us are more than those who are with them. As Paul said, or as the writer in Romans says, if God is for us, who can be against us? So back to verse 17. Where you die, I will die, and I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. So we're back to the words of Ruth. She says, where you die, I will die. I'm committed to this relationship with you and with Israel and with the God of Israel. I'm committed for the rest of my life. Now think about it. Orpah has just left. Orpah's gone back to Moab and they're on the road. Ruth didn't need to commit. There was no one pressuring Ruth to make any kind of commitment. In fact, if anything, her mother-in-law, Naomi, is urging her to go back to Moab. So the way I see it, Ruth could have easily said to Naomi, you know what, Naomi, just calm down. You're suffering post-traumatic stress. You've lost your husband and your sons. Why don't I just go with you to Bethlehem? I'll settle you in. I'll apply for a job. And if things don't work out, I can always come back to Moab and catch up with Orpah and we'll sort something out. Let me just come with you and see how it goes. You know, in the end, Naomi was listening to her in verse 18. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. It's as though Naomi said, okay, I've said my piece. And she walked silently the rest of the way up to Bethlehem. So Naomi wasn't respecting Ruth at this point in time. And there's no need for Ruth to make any kind of commitment. So what's going on? May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. Ruth takes a vow. This isn't a decision that I'm going to go to Bethlehem. I'm going to go with you. That's what I'm deciding. Ruth takes a vow. She says, till death do us part. Now, you often hear that in traditional marriage vows when a husband and wife, they're saying their vows and they're at the altar and there's the expression, till death do us part. We're making a covenant. We are entering into a covenant relationship as husband and wife to become one person. And we are joining together till death do us part. That's the origin of the marriage vows is from the story of Ruth. That's where those words come from. This wasn't from an ancient marriage vow. This was from a vow made by a woman to her mother-in-law. It's a vow till death do us part. It's a vow of allegiance. It's a vow of citizenship. This is the language of a covenant. Till death do us part. On my life, I stake this. So the question is, who else makes covenants? That's not a rhetorical question. Who else makes covenants? God does. God is a God of covenants. And this is the amazing thing. God doesn't need to make covenants. But it's in his great mercy that God makes covenants with us. And it's the same with Ruth. She didn't need to make a covenant. This was not a covenant situation. This was not required. It wasn't wanted. It wasn't asked for. It wasn't something that was required by her. And Naomi said, you've got to make if you come with me to Bethlehem, you've got to make a commitment now before we cross the Jordan. Naomi's telling her to go home. And she makes a covenant. The words, I will never leave you. Who do they remind you of? I will never leave you. God. These are the words of God. Let's have a look. I will not leave you. To Jacob in Genesis 28, verse 15, behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I've done what I have promised. These are the words of God. These are the words of Ruth. To Israel, be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, for it is the Lord your God who goes with you. Don't be bitter. Don't be afraid. Why? He will not leave you or forsake you. To Joshua, just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Solomon. Then David said to Solomon, his son, be strong and courageous and do it. Do not be afraid and do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God, even my God, is with you. He will not leave you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished. And Jesus to us, I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. So it's the same place. They're in the same place. Naomi sees death, loss, bitterness. Orpah also sees it. And that's why she turns around and leaves a hopeless situation. Ruth sees hope, security. She declares a covenant relationship on the road of decision before she got there. She didn't go and try it out. She made a decision on the road of uncertainty. And I think a little bit like Hagar, in Genesis chapter 16, it says God saw Hagar. I think at this point on the road, God sees Ruth and God says, this is a woman that I can work with. She even sounds like me. And God says, I want her to be part of my story and I want her to be part of my plan. This is the kind of person I've been looking for. He didn't find it in Israel. He found it in a Moabite widow who was not even in the promised land. And so God says, I want to include her in the line to my son. And so Ruth becomes the mother of Obed, and Obed becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse becomes the father of King David, which places Ruth as the great King David's great-grandmother. And as John Popel says, who does an excellent study on Ruth chapter 2, if you want to listen to it anytime, I highly recommend it. He says in those days, the generation gap was tighter than it is today. And so with no uncertainty, David would have sat on the knee of Ruth as his great-grandmother. And she would have told him these stories about who she was and what she saw on the road. In some ways, Ruth's words are fighting words. Despite what you may be saying, Naomi, despite what you might be feeling, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying here. I'm staying right here beside you. It reminds me of Paul's words to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 12, fight the good fight of faith. Our faith is to be fought out. It's not passive. It's not something that you slip into and slip out of. It's something that you take hold of. Take hold of eternal life. Grab it with both hands, to which you were called and about which you made the good confession in the presence of many witnesses. And so Paul's advice to Timothy is fight, take hold of eternal life, and remember the covenant that you made. Remember the covenant relationship that you spoke of when you made a good confession in the presence of many witnesses. Let's go back to that road of decision, Timothy, and stand there in those words. And one of the great ironies of Ruth chapter 1 is at a time when Naomi feels abandoned and cursed and bitter, here beside her is Ruth. And Ruth is manifesting God by speaking out his words, I will not leave you. Till death do us part. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your God will be my God. And so we find this at the very end of Ruth. The blessing to Naomi was Ruth. She wasn't surrounded by death. She was surrounded by someone speaking covenant relationship. And it's profound that this Moabite woman, who probably learnt her scriptures through Naomi, through a husband, but not a father-in-law, he was dead, who had never set foot in the Holy Land, has such clarity on who God is, his character, and the fact that she can take shelter under his wings in a place of insecurity and uncertainty. And it's not something that's been forced on her or even expected. It's something that she claims, she grabs hold of. We live in a world today which I continuously hear people say, this is who I am. I can't help who I am. This is the way I was born. This is how I behave. Accept me how I am. I can't change. And yet here in this story of Ruth, we have a woman who's in a precarious position, in a difficult situation, who says, you know what? This is who I'm going to be. It's not my past, not where I've come from. I choose my identity. My identity is not something that I was born with. This is something I'm going to choose. And I choose the God of Israel. That's who I choose. And so the story of Ruth and her words and her actions remind me of someone else described in that great chapter of the faithful in Hebrews 11. And as I read this, think of Ruth. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called out to go to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. She'd known a little bit about life back in Bethlehem, but it was certainly the unknown. It wasn't a digital time. She'd never seen it. It was only passed on stories and a whole lot of uncertainty. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land. She was a foreigner. This wasn't going to change. Living in tents with Jacob, Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise, for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. He was looking for something that couldn't be seen, the unseen. These all died in faith, not having received the things that promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar off, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. That's Ruth. For people who speak thus make it clear they are seeking a homeland. And that's why God heard her. She was declaring covenant relationship language to do with making a new home. If they had been thinking of that land, like Orpah, from which they'd gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. And she, at the moment she makes this covenant, was when there were people returning. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be their God, to be called their God. And that is why they're the people that he includes in his story and in his line, for he has prepared a city for them. Abraham was committed. Abraham was remarkable. Why? Because he left the known for the unknown. He left comfort and security and his language and his people and his family, and there was no turning back and there was no looking back. Unlike Lot's wife who looked back, Abraham was fully committed. Now, he wasn't perfect and he made mistakes and he had insecurities, but generally he was committed to the cause. And he certainly got that he was waiting for a city. He wasn't a city builder like Nimrod, like Esau, like Cain. Ruth is the same. Ruth's story is ordinary. And perhaps that's kind of what makes it compelling. She doesn't come from a famous family, certainly not recorded in the Bible. She doesn't have great riches and position. She's just a widow, one from an enemy nation at that. There's nothing going in her favor, but she is brave and her faith never wavers. We talked about Timothy and Paul. I think baptism is the same. We cross from death to life. Baptism begins with commitment, with declaring a covenant, a good confession. And then the waters of baptism are like crossing the Jordan, like Ruth's journey, having to cross the Jordan, which leads to a new life. But the decision as to who you are going to be is made on the road. It's made before you're baptized, not afterwards. It's not at the destination. This is what laying a good foundation looks like. We make the decision on the road. We decide beforehand. Certainly, Ruth would have known the Exodus story. So this is hundreds of years after Moses. And she would have known about this mysterious nation, Israel, and the taking of Jericho, potentially Joshua and the judges. And as I said, there's no doubt Naomi would have shared her faith and told her about the God of Israel and his mighty works. And a big part of Naomi, of Ruth choosing to be with Naomi was to choose to become a Jew. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And as Ruth makes this declaration about joining with Naomi, we're introduced to this concept of citizenship. And it's almost like a citizenship ceremony on the road, a declaration of nationality. She says, I am becoming a Jew. I'm becoming part of the line of Abraham. She identifies herself as being part of Israel. And she does it till death do us part. This is something that she takes. And so the concept of citizenship, it becomes a big theme in the story of Ruth. And it becomes a thing. A citizenship is to be taken. It's offered by God, and it's to be taken by us. It's not to be forced on you. It's not to be something that you're waiting to be compelled. This is something that you decide to become. Now, therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. So, what does citizenship look like? And Ruth is a great story about what's involved. So you want to be a citizen of the kingdom of God. You want to be a citizen of Israel. What benefits can you expect from being a citizen? And the answers are contained in the story of Ruth. And so if we go to Ruth chapter 2, we're in Ruth chapter 2. Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the freshly minted citizen of Israel, who was a Moabite, said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. In other words, the next day they wake up, Naomi's still depressed. And Ruth says, Naomi, she asked for permission. She says, please let me go and go through the fields and scrounge around gleaning, which is what people did who were poor. They'd follow the harvesters as they were the harvest. What was left over, they'd collect and put into a bag and take home and grind up and make into bread and eat, and they wouldn't starve to death. What does she do? She gets on with collecting food. So this new citizen doesn't sit around, isn't waiting for God to do something. What does she do? She's hardworking. She gets on with it. She does something. And in verse 7, when Boaz arrives and he says, who is this woman? The overseer, the guy in charge of the field, he says, she's a Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. Little do they know that she's a citizen of Israel in her heart. In fact, they were born as Israelites. She's staked her life on it. And she's made a covenant relationship to death do us part. She looks like a Moabite. She sounds like a Moabite. She's an Israelite. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. So she's polite. She doesn't just step into the field. She asks the guy in charge. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. She's hardworking. She gets on with it. Reminds me of another story about someone who was in a precarious position. Elijah in the cave in 1 Kings chapter 19. He's been on Mount Carmel. He's slayed the prophets of Baal. He's prayed and God's broken the drought. And yet Jezebel, the scary woman, says, I'm going to have your life, Elijah. And what does he do? He runs away with his tail between his legs. He's frightened. He's got the power of God surrounding him on Mount Carmel, and yet he's frightened and he ends up in a cave. And God says, what are you doing in a cave? And then there's earth, wind, and fire. And then there's a gentle whisper. And what does the whisper say? It says, what are you doing in a cave, Elijah? Why are you sitting in a cave? And Elijah's got all these reasons. No one's following you. What does God do? God gives Elijah a list of jobs. He says, go back the way you came, go to the desert of Damascus, and when you get there, anoint Hazael, king of over Aram, anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha to succeed you as a prophet. God gives Elijah a list of jobs. Go on and do stuff. God's saying to Elijah, I work with people who are doing things, not hiding in caves alone. And God, in the story of Ruth, works with her. She's a person that gets on. And so Ruth, without any prompting, leaves her shell-shocked and depressed Naomi and gets on with the job, not resting in the blessing of God, but getting on with her life. God is a God of industry. God is working every day, sunrise, sunset. You only need to look in the garden. The heavens declare that he is working. Jesus is working hard. He's listening to our prayers. He's directing his angels. He's looking in on the lives of the whole world. And there's other great examples of workers. I think of Joseph in Potiphar's house. I think of Joseph in prison. He ends up running the prison. I think of Nehemiah. He's not just sitting around waiting for Jerusalem to be rebuilt. He wants to build the city. I think of Jesus' final instructions to Peter, feed my sheep. Go and be a shepherd. Don't be fishing. Go and feed the sheep. And as Ruth works and gleans and provides for Naomi, who's catatonic, who's in a state of depression, things seem to work out for Ruth. Okay, so what are the lessons that we get out of this first story of Ruth? Well, the big ones for me are choice. You can choose who you are. That choice is in your hands. It is not forced on you. You are not born with it. You make a choice. Ruth made a choice on the road, an incredible choice, and we can all look at that covenant that she declared and say, I want to be part of that. I want to state that in my life. Declarations. It's like putting a stake in the ground. That's what she does. She puts a stake in the ground and she says, this is who I am. She declares something. There's passion in the words of Ruth. I think we should be passionate about what we believe. Spoken words are powerful. When we speak, we become. When God created light, it doesn't say he made light. It doesn't say he made the waters separate. He says he spoke, let there be light. God speaks. We live in a voice-activated creation. Genesis chapter 1, each day, God, it says, and God said, and God said, and God said. The message being that what you say is what you become. And as Ruth speaks and makes a powerful declaration, that's who she becomes. So use your words to declare who you are and who you want to be. If you are struggling with the fruits of the Spirit, whether any of them, peace, joy, long-suffering, kindness, gentleness, self-control. If you struggle with self-control, speak it. I am going to have more self-control. Lord, help me with my self-control. Speak it. Determination. Ruth is determined, and we worship a determined God. Covenants. I love the fact that Ruth didn't need to make a covenant, just as God doesn't need to make a covenant. But thank God he is a God of covenants. In fact, he loves covenants. He loves covenants that mean something, not words. Covenants that are lived out. Seekers. God is looking for people to work with. He is looking. His eyes are looking. Declare it today. I want to be a seeker. Adversity, even amongst adversity, even if you feel like you are walking through the shadow of death, even if you are surrounded by death and depression, even within your own family situation, God is working. You are not alone. You might feel like you're alone. You might feel that God is even punishing you. You might feel that God has cursed you in the circumstances of things that just seem haphazard. And it's like, Lord, what are you doing to my life? Why am I under the magnifying glass? Know from the story of Ruth that God doesn't leave us. This is a period that you are passing through. God is working, but you need to trust him. And finally, from Psalm 139, verse 7 to 12. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light will become night around me, even in the darkness, I will not be dark to you. The night will shine like day, for darkness is as light to you.